A lot of people have talked about how weird this is, and I'm sure nobody wants to see or watch or listen to another bunch of people lament how weird this year's been. But goodness gracious, it's been something I couldn't even imagine. I honestly expected to play football last fall. Maybe I was naive, but we didn't play football, obviously. Aside from a few teams, and it's just it's shocking that it happened the way it did, and that choices were made, and I think probably justified choices were made. But I certainly felt an emptiness in the fall that I had never felt since I really started loving college football.
Absolutely. I didn't know what to do with myself for a lot of Saturdays, and you obviously you're waiting for Sunday all of a sudden, and I've never been as much of an NFL guy as I have college, and it left a huge void. There's no question about
it. Some
yeah,
teams,
for someone like myself who really who plans your whole year around those Saturdays in the fall, it was very surreal to all of a sudden go from having 15, 16 Saturdays consecutively that you're not home off doing everything that we do in the world of D2, and all of a sudden you're at home watching those games on TV, which I'm thankful we at least had that to get us through. But it's very surreal, very different, and I don't know about you guys, but I'm really hoping we'll at least get some good game action in the spring and really start looking forward to fall 2021.
And I think that's a good point. And it's the way I've described it is that people have played games this year, but there certainly has been no 2021 season. It just does not seem like it. We did, as most people know, we did have some individual teams playing games for whatever reason, which we'll actually get to later. But there was a hole that was left, as you said, Chuck. I've spent the last 30 years of my life counting down the start of college football season after the national championship game was played, and and it's just been such a huge part of my life that it was tough that it was missing. It's also interesting, guys, to see how the different levels dealt with things differently. Division II, pretty much most schools shut it down. I think that it was probably the best decision based upon the cost. But in the FCS, they have handled it differently, and the NAIA has certainly handled it differently. What has happened in your guys' neck of the woods?
Chuck, I'll let you go first.
So, speaking specifically about what's happening in the world of Division II, I think we really have to talk first about the decision from the Division II council level to cancel fall championships, which was a very difficult decision and impacted all of our fall student athletes and all of our conferences. I do think it was the right decision.
Yeah.
And I think doing that really gave the conferences and the conference members the ability to do what's going to be best for them and not feel that they're obligated to try to work against the tide, work in very difficult conditions to try to get a team on the field just because national championships are at stake or the rest of the teams in division we're playing. I do think that was the right decision. I know not everyone agrees with me on that, but I do think it was the right decision to cancel those fall championships. But doing that then basically pushed those decisions downhill to the conferences to say, what do you want to do for your fall championship sports? You can play, you can look at moving some fall sports to the spring, or you can just not have those sports at all during this academic year. When those conversations first started to happen, I had been on a couple of calls with conference commissioners that first started mentioning the idea of playing fall sports in the spring semester. And I think the consensus at that point, now this is in the August timeframe, I think the consensus then was there's just no way that we can play fall sports in the spring semester. And you get a little bit further down the line, all of a sudden that starts to seem like a viable alternative. So by the time we got to the end of the summer, early fall, we really had to start looking at, if we're going to play football during this academic year, it has to be in the spring semester. So now you've got all these conferences in Division II. We got 16 conferences that sponsor football. You've got all these conferences that have to try to figure out, what do we want to do? What's best for our members? how are things in our region? What's the right go forward path? So now you've got 16 different conferences trying to figure out the path forward. So in the East region, let's start in Super Region 1. In Super Region 1, you've got 4 conferences, the Northeast 10, the PSAC, the Mountain East, and the GMAC. For the spring, you've really only got 2 of those conferences that are going to formally play spring schedule. So the Mountain East is going to play about a 4-game schedule with a conference championship. The GMAC is also going to play a formal schedule. The Northeast 10, not looking good for really anything happening out of the Northeast 10 this spring. You might see some scrimmages. You might see some joint practices. We don't really know what that looks like yet, but unlikely that we'll see anything formal between teams on the field. Similar looking situation in the PSAC. You might see some joint practices. You might see some scrimmages. I think it's possible you'll even see some Division II against Division III scrimmages, but they will not have a formal season. And to kind of give you some perspective on where coaches' heads are with this, when the PSAC decided we're not going to have a formal schedule for football, the announcement included the provision that if 6 or more teams wanted to play, the conference would help facilitate a schedule and a championship. And they didn't have 6 teams that said, we want to sign up for that out of 16. So I think it kind of shows you where coaches' heads are at with the whole concept of playing spring football. And when you look at the South region, SR2, where typically we're going to have much better weather conditions for practice and games in the spring, the thought process really isn't much different. The South Atlantic Conference is the only league of the 4 that will have a formal conference schedule. And it's only going to be 4 games for the conference championship. So we're really excited about that in the Southeast. A lot of disappointment from the GSC fans. They're not going to have much in the way of football. Only a couple teams have scheduled some one-off independent games, not much happening in the CIAA, and only a few games coming out of the SIAC. So in the whole East region, looking at north to south in Super Region 1 and Super Region 2, you got 3 conferences that are going to play a formal football schedule. But it's going to be a very limited schedule, 4 to 5 games at the most. There are some exciting nuggets in there that we'll get to a little bit later when we talk about some things, but overall, that's the landscape around Division 2. And it's very similar to what we're seeing out of Division 3. Division 3 is much larger. I think it's 28 conferences and almost 250 teams that make up all of Division 3, and only a few are playing. So there's very, very little participation in the Division 3 ranks. Similar to what we're seeing out of Division 2, the ones that are playing 4 to 5 game schedules, trying to wedge that in between mid-March to mid-April, although there is something that's actually being played right now. So if you're a junkie and you really need to get your fix, there are some Division 3 games happening right now. You can go check those out on Friday and Saturday. But very minimal participation in Division 3. And that's really nationwide, although Division 3 is more concentrated in the East region. So lots to say, lots to talk about, but as far as what's actually happening on the field, not as much as we thought we might see when we backed up to the end of the summer and started talking about spring football. I think the appetite for actually playing in the spring has gone down quite a bit. So not as much happening on the formal schedule, but I know that there's still a lot of other things that are happening as far as some conversations about joint practices, some scrimmages, and the NAIA and FCS are actually playing some championship football. But I know you know a lot more about that.
Matt, go ahead and talk about that, because there's a strong NAIA and FCS presence in the area in which you live.
Yeah, what's interesting is obviously being in the upper Midwest. It's interesting to see how things are different in my area versus how things may be happening in Chuck's area, for example, in the Southeast. I've got a mixed bag where I'm at in Sioux Falls, because we have, for example, I took a look and we've got, just down the road, there was some RMAC teams, like, for example, South Dakota Mines, Black Hills State, Colorado Mesa, who all played a few games in the fall. Now, they all had brand new coaches, and one can make a case that maybe they wanted to get out and see what they had and whatnot. And then, you go ahead and you take a look at what's the spring look like. Well, the spring out in this direction, I take a look at whether it's the Northern Sun, I take a look at the RMAC right next door. They're all kind of looking at this like, originally, maybe let's go ahead and try and find a way to have some gameplay, because that was so many people were thinking that back in August or September. If we're not playing now, we've got to be playing, in the spring, right? And things I think slowly turned into, yeah, that might mean a whole lot of games being played in the calendar year for 2021. So when I take a look, for example, in chatting with a lot of the head coaches in the Northern Sun, a lot of the feedback was we want to have a little bit, we want to be able to have our kids play some joint practices and scrimmages with someone else, because we've got a long time of just practicing against each other. But we're not really going to do a whole lot more than that. So I think you're going to see a few of those kind of scrimmages. Some teams may be a little more ambitious with that and a few more matchups than others. But at the same time, we're going to see the FCS up here with the North Dakota States and the South Dakota States and some teams that are pretty big nationally. They're looking to play their league schedule, and they're playing for a championship at the FCS level this spring, and then we'll obviously go back at it this fall. And if you take a hard look at it, you can see, like, if you're in North Dakota State, for example, who's obviously had a world of success, they might be playing 25, 28 football games in this calendar year. That's a lot of football. And I don't think there's a lot of people across the landscape who are super comfortable with that many games, because you're really running the risk of injury at that point pretty considerably. But then at some of the other levels, for example, as Chuck mentioned, D3's got a similar outlook to how D2 does, especially in my area as well. So you're not going to see a whole lot of change there. But the NAI level, I think, is pretty interesting because of the fact that they've had half of their membership. A lot of schools up in my area, especially the Morningsides of the world, defending NAI champion, Grandview, Northwest Iowa, Dickinson State, all real high-ranking NAI teams who've already played their regular season last fall. But then if I went down to where Chuck's at, and you have Lindsey Wilson and Georgetown and schools like that in the Southeast, they're just starting to play. So you have half the membership who's already played their schedule, the other half who's playing it, including, in Chicago. They played a football game last week in the snow. That's a pretty tough place to be playing spring football. It's more like playing winter football, really.
Exactly.
So they're going to play for a championship also. So this is a spring unlike any other, where you're going to have all of a sudden the FCS has the potential to really get top billing, from a football standpoint, because they might be able to get on ESPN where they otherwise wouldn't be able to on a regular basis. You're going to have the NAI out there starting to play for, a championship in mid-April. And so it's much, much different than we've ever looked at things before this time of year.
One other thing that's interesting that I think is coming of this, in the area in which I live, I live in Kansas City, so there's a GLVC presence here, certainly an MIAA presence here. So you're kind of dealing with teams in that area. The GLIAC is in this, super region as well. We haven't seen a lot of great non-conference games in the past, but what we're seeing now, or at least what I'm hearing, and I don't know if you guys are hearing the same thing, but I'm hearing lots of scrimmages coming together. And I am hearing some very interesting scrimmages possibly occurring, some great non-conference matchups. I've heard Grand Valley will travel to the NSIC and vice versa. I've even heard a rumor that Grand Valley might travel down to Valdosta to scrimmage. These are not confirmed, and we all know how we've dealt with quote unquote fake news lately, and you hear that all the time. So I can't say that I know this for sure, but these are things that I'm hearing. And when you're trying to make lemonade out of lemons, I really like the idea of some of these teams who might not get to face each other during the regular season, sometimes during the playoffs, facing each other in scrimmages. It's also interesting, Matt, and I think this is something that would probably be more appropriate for your neck of the woods, even though Chuck said it earlier. I've also heard of some talk of some NAIA and Division II scrimmages. So specifically, I guess either of you guys, what have you heard along those lines?
Yeah, I can tell you up in my neck of the woods and talking with coaches in the Northern Sun. Heck, I even talked with an NAIA coach that I know as well. They're not looking to have official games,
Right.
but if you're an NAIA team, especially a playoff team, how are you going to get yourself sharp for the national tournament that's going to begin in mid-April?
Right.
Well, it makes sense to want to go ahead and lock horns with somebody who's going to be in the middle of a season. So I've heard whispers, for example, Morningside, talking about going up and whether it's a northern state, whether it's a Mankato. I've heard some whispers of all of those things, along with, on our message board, you may see some different things on the forums, where people are close to the programs. And none of this stuff is official because of the fact that this is really going to be an NFL style joint practice if they go ahead and do something like this.
Right.
And it's really probably more for the benefit of the NAIA team at that point, because of the fact that they're the ones who are going to be playing, meaningful games in a matter of weeks after that.
Right.
But if some of those things were to actually come to fruition, that would be pretty interesting,
I think
especially for us, us football nerds who would find a matchup like that pretty fascinating. So I've also heard Grandview out of Des Moines is possibly another team that may have interest in doing that. So I'm kind of keeping my ears, open for hearing about that stuff and it really happening, certainly.
Are you hearing anything in your neck of the woods about joint practices, Chuck?
Well, I think you're going to see that. And I don't think that we'll hear as much about it. I think when it comes to the concept of a scrimmage or joint practices, those can be pulled together a little bit with a little less formality and on shorter notice than actually publishing a game schedule and announcing, hey, we're actually going to play on this date, and arranging the officials and all of the media that goes into actually hosting a game. So I don't know that we'll hear as much about it, but I do fully expect that we're going to see quite a bit of that. If you look in the South, now the South Atlantic Conference is going to be playing, so all their teams will have opportunities. The GSC, one of the strongest conferences in NCAA Division II, has a lot of heavy hitters in that league that have nothing on the calendar. When you look at the league from top to bottom, I think the only team that has a game scheduled is West Alabama. They're going to meet Savannah State.
Right.
A little bit later this spring.
That's
West
a pretty
Florida
interesting game.
That is, to the point you made earlier, Brandon, that is a fascinating game, and that's on a neutral site. So it's as far as I can tell, it's the only game that either team is going to play until we get to the fall. So what an opportunity for both of those teams. Right. It's an opponent they've never seen before. They actually get to get on the buses and go play in a stadium that they've never been to before. I think it's going to have a bowl game type of an atmosphere to it, at least for the competitors. I don't know if they'll have fans there or not, but I think it's going to have a bowl game type of a feel to it. So really excited for both of those programs, but I think you'll see some more matchups like that, not necessarily in a formal game atmosphere. But if you're running a program like a Valdosta State, West Florida, West Georgia, you expect to be in the national championship picture. I don't think those coaches want to deviate from their normal spring schedule that much, which is why they are content to not have a formal schedule that they're playing this spring. They really want to stay in their normal routine. But they also haven't been on the field since November of 2019. Right. So that's a long layoff. And I think those coaches will want to have opportunities to get their teams on the field and face somebody other than the guys that they lift weights with in the year round. And I think you'll see that in some other conferences as well.
We talked, or at least I had mentioned that we'd talk about this later, but since we brought it up a couple of times, I think it's important to note the difference in what some schools have tried to do. And I think that there's a trend. Matt had hinted at it. I was the one that kind of theorized it or came up with it. If you look at the schools that were very adamant about playing in the fall, and even some of the schools that are adamant about playing games in the spring, most of the time there are schools with a new coach rebuilding, schools that aren't your traditional powers. And I think, you see that example both in terms of the conferences that play, and you see that example as you mentioned, about the schools that play. West Florida didn't play any games. Ferris State didn't play any games. Northwest Missouri didn't play any games. Grand Valley didn't play any games. Valdosta State didn't play any games. On the other hand, there were a lot of schools with brand new coaches that did. A couple of RMAC schools had brand new coaches and they played games. West Texas played some games. Of course, there's the stadium issue there, but Hunter Hughes is still a fairly new coach there. He's trying to build a program there. You look at a lot of the other schools, and almost every one of them, aside from Chadron State, had a coach that was either in his first year or usually within 3 years. Missouri Western played, but their coaches, this would have been his third year. So it has been, I think that you're seeing the difference in the incentives that each program has to play. And I think that's carrying over into the spring and how they're treating it. Do you guys see any deviation from that?
I don't. And I think you saw some really good examples of what you were just talking about in the FCS level too, because FCS programs had a few more opportunities to try to get some games scheduled because FBS opponents were adding and losing games left, right, and center. So there were a lot of opportunities if you were willing to schedule a game during the week to play on Saturday. There were a lot of opportunities for some FCS programs to put together a 4, 5, 6 game schedule. And some of those programs have said, we're comfortable with that being our season. And we're going to go through our normal spring and we're not going to participate in this championship.
A good,
so there were a few that did that. And there's a few that will still contest in the spring as well. But I think those programs that were able to get some time in, they're comfortable with that being their schedule for 2020, and they want to go through the normal 2021 routine. Now, to your point about some programs that were really aggressive, I'll give you a couple of really good examples of some programs who are looking to really just get their team on the field, learn about themselves, and get some great game experience. In this Super Region 2, we've got 2 first-year programs, Barton College in Wilson, North Carolina, and Erskine College, Erskine University in Due West, South Carolina. Both are in their first year of competition. 2020 in the fall was supposed to be their inaugural season for both of those. So those players are just absolutely chomping at the bit. They have been practicing for the last year to 2 years. They've only ever seen themselves in competition. They need to get out there and really test themselves. Erskine has actually scheduled 7 games. So they were really aggressive at trying to put together a schedule that gives them the most opportunity to get their players on the field. Barton is playing 5 games. Their head coach, Chip Hester, who's a former head coach in Division II at Catawba, he's really, really excited about being able to play this season. And he feels that in a way, it gives them a little bit of an advantage because they get to play a couple games, learn a lot about themselves, and then they have a shorter time turnaround to take all that information they're going to get this spring and apply that to their preparation for the fall of 2021. Another great example is Shorter College in Shorter University in the GSC. They have not been able to get much going since they joined the GSC. They're really looking for an opportunity to build a name for themselves, get some positive momentum. They went out and scheduled 4 or 5 games for this spring. So most of the GSC is going to be dormant. They went out and scheduled 4 or 5 games because they really want to try to get some experience, get their guys on the field, and really use this as an opportunity to build something and get ready for the fall of 2021.
Up in my part of the world, I saw some interesting mix where in the Northern Sun, for example, I think there was some schools who would have really liked to have played a little bit in the fall. And of course, they matched up with some of the new coaches, for example, like Mike Schmidt at Northern State. And, if I also look down to Wayne State, they were in states with South Dakota and Nebraska that weren't being super heavily regulated on the COVID side. So there was a better chance of football being played there. For example, here in South Dakota, they played basically regular high school football, and everything else has happened pretty much on schedule. But then a lot of the Northern Sun, the league itself, is in Minnesota. Well, Minnesota's been pretty locked down. So it's hard to get the league as a whole to have interest in playing football when a lot of the schools are in Minnesota itself. So I think that you may have seen if there was some flexibility, there may have been some teams in the Northern Sun who were interested in playing, and maybe even going a little bit west and playing teams in the RMAC, because they could have gone just right down the road to, South Dakota Mines or Black Hill State, squads like that, and
Both
played
with,
against people that they wouldn't play in the season.
both with first-year head coaches too, motivated to play.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's kind of a lot of that just happens to have all fallen in this year. But in my chatting with a lot of other coaches throughout the league, there's no doubt that if there's programs, like, for example, when I talked to University of Sioux Falls and I talked to Augustana, both of which are here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, both were in the playoffs last year.
Right.
I don't think that I didn't get the impression they were as compelled to need to have games, because they know a little bit more what they got. They got a good thing going, playoff squads, recent success, everything else. The only real exception is when I chatted with Todd Hoffman up at Mankato. Obviously, they've been extremely successful over the last decade. Just went to national championship. But a lot of the names that you're used to seeing, with the Zylstras and the Guns and guys like that, are no longer on this team. So Todd is, I think, in a state where more than he's been in the last handful of years, where he's trying to figure out where they're at. So a lot of the new coaches and the situations that they're in, like we talked about, they're motivated to try and find out where they're at. And Todd Hoffner at Mankato came off to me like he's thinking the same, because he's looking to have some joint practices with maybe 3, 4, 5 teams, which is a little bit more than I'm seeing with a lot of teams in my area, where maybe they're saying, maybe we want to go ahead and scrimmage with maybe 2 teams. And maybe if we could, it would be great to have somebody that we're scrimmaging that's not in our conference.
Right.
But up where I'm at, that's somewhat limited, unless you're tapping into some of the NAIA or, looking at some B3 or otherwise. But I'm once again, I'm interested to see some of those different matchups with the scrimmages. But, I'll be interested to see what Mankato comes out with, because they're looking at things a little differently than some of the others in the league who are pretty established.
Hey, I'd like to transition really quick, guys. It's something that I think is going to be a factor, but it really does apply to you, Chuck. And I hate to put you, spring this on you, because you might not know, but Rogan Wells transferred from Valdosta State to Tuscaloosa. And that is the biggest D2 to D2 transfer that I can remember probably ever. Somebody will probably remind me of something that I've forgotten, but that is, a All-American type quarterback, a national championship quarterback, leaving one program to go to another, and it happens to be in your conference. What do you know about that?
It was pretty extraordinary, earth-shattering kind of news, which we don't normally expect to see that in Division II at this time of the year. What actually prompted him to make the move, I can't say with certainty. I don't know. What I can tell you is, if there was some interest in moving on from Valdosta State for whatever his reasons were, I do know he said he'd like to be a little bit closer to home. Tusculum is a little closer to his home in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Okay. Tusculum is a good landing spot for him because of some familiarity. When he was at Valdosta State, he played under Kerwin Bell, who was the head coach of Valdosta State, no longer the head coach, but was the head coach when they won the national championship. And Cade Bell, Kerwin Bell's son, was also on the staff there. Rogan Wells had a good relationship with both of them. Kerwin and Cade Bell both have a long relationship with Tusculum head coach Jerry Odom. They have history from their time at Jacksonville University, a program that unfortunately no longer exists. They have a long history together, and those relationships kind of all came together to create this opportunity for Rogan Wells to play his last season of eligibility somewhere else. Tusculum is a great landing spot, and I'm super excited to see what that could lead to for that program. They've been so close in the last couple of years to breaking through to becoming a program that could really contend for a championship. What's really held them back has just been consistency at the quarterback position. They've had good players there. They just really haven't had somebody who could really take a hold of the team. when you add somebody who is legitimately one of the 2 or 3 best players in all of Division II right now, that is an enormous addition to that team, and that's an understatement to say the least. So very excited about that. It was unexpected to say the least, but a huge piece of off-season news. And the great thing about it is now we don't actually have to wait until September to see that on the field. I'm really excited to see what that translates to in just a couple of weeks.
And Matt, let's transition
Brandon?
on that, because you've had a lot of players in your conference that have left their school, both to go to other schools and to higher level schools.
Yeah, I've seen, I think it's a matter of guys who are kind of in the back portion of their career, potentially looking to go elsewhere. Mankato's had a few guys who've gone either, they had a transfer to NDSU. They had, a longtime running back who basically just decided to move on to a job in his career. You could even see that with potentially Mankato and JD Akawa, their returning quarterback. You have a guy like that, and you're going to have a lot of them, I think, across the league. You look at Sioux Falls, and they had, Gabe Watson, who was returning from an injury, who was, one of the top rushers in the league a few years ago, and he ended up transferring to the Texas Longhorns, and found out there was a lot of people in that running back room and didn't get the kind of chances he was hoping. Obviously with that kind of transfer. Sioux Falls had a real strong corner that's transferred to D1 Samford University, and so there's plenty of that just in the ones I've seen, and I'm sure there's going to be plenty of others that we're going to find out about in the coming months, because I think you can only practice so long when these guys are in anticipation of potentially maybe thinking they may go next level, right? Or maybe they want another opportunity and they just feel like they have been strung along for a while. I think that they get a little anxious at times as well. And you see the FCS, for example, they're playing football here in the spring. So a transfer like that seems to make some sense. When Watson transferred to Texas, they were playing football immediately. Right. So they're getting a chance to play football right away, and maybe even elevate their profile potentially and things like that. It's certainly a calculated risk. Right. But I think
I want to point something out, Matt. And sorry to interrupt, but I think it's important to understand too, for people who don't know, that Division II is a partial scholarship model. So a kid might be going to a place that costs $40,000, $20,000 a year. And let's say he gets a $5,000 scholarship, a $10,000 scholarship. So he's still paying $10,000, $20,000 a year to go to school. Sometimes, especially your upperclassmen, might simply decide if they're not on a team that's probably a national championship contender, if they are not all-American level, NFL guy, even though you talked about situations where that guy would want to leave. But we do have to understand that sometimes it's just a good life choice, a responsible life choice by these young men to move on. It's not selfishness. It's not anything other than, I have my degree in what I want to do, and it makes no sense for me to stick around and pay $15,000 more to go and play a season in which we're going to go 6-5.
Well, and you look at the fact that I think a lot of guys at the D2 level have a pretty realistic view of what they're doing at this level from a football standpoint. They would love to continue to play, but if it really means putting their entire life on hold, right, that's a decision that guys need to make. Some of them are going to say, I need to finish this out with this football thing. Others are going to say, maybe I'm getting too great an opportunity to pass up, and I have to take that chance at this point, and I can't just kind of wait around for it.
Some might get a graduate
some of that
degree
down there in your.
Yeah, I think that's something that I don't have a really good handle on, and we may not for another year or two. It's just how much roster movement there has been between the end of 2019 and where we are today, and how that also impacts us going forward. Everybody gets a free pass as far as eligibility for this year. To the point you made about everybody being basically on a partial scholarship model, Brandon, we can't assume that everybody who has eligibility remaining is going to stay in their program.
Right.
It might just be time for them to move on and get their career started. They may have
Right,
families that they need to support, families need to get started.
Mhm.
And these players are not on full academic support. Most of them are on partial scholarships. And so when you look at paying to continue to stay in school so that you can continue to play football, it's a little bit less appealing than if you're on a full academic scholarship.
Correct.
So it may take another year or two for it to really shake out to see how that impacts us. I will say from a roster standpoint, I was at least very encouraged that on National Signing Day a couple of weeks ago, the numbers were pretty good. Nationwide, there were a lot fewer athletes that were able to sign national letters of intent compared to last year. Those numbers were down, but a lot of Division II programs were still able to sign pretty healthy looking classes. And that was really a relief to me, because I was really afraid that the athletes who might suffer the most from what we've experienced over the last 12 months might actually be the high school class of 2021, and possibly not having as many opportunities for next year because of players staying in the program. And also, I don't have access to the transfer portal, but I'm told the number of names that was in the transfer portal was just enormous. And if you're a coach who's looking to fill out some needs, it could be really tempting to go look at that transfer portal option and look a little bit less towards your high school programs, especially in some states where they weren't playing high school football. So I was very happy to see that we still got a lot of high school seniors joining college football next year.
Let me give you my opinion on what's happened, at least my analysis. When I've been following National Signing Day since we started the site in 2000. It's one of my favorite days of the year. So I see it around the country over and over. It's much better publicized than it was 20 years ago. But let's say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the lists of signees more closely mirrored looked like what we saw this year. Most teams getting around 25, 30, some as low as 20, and there have been some small ones too that will continue to trickle in. I think the difference this year is that there were fewer very small scholarships that were awarded or offered to kids, which they accepted, than there have been the last few years. We've seen all of these National Signing Day lists expand to like 50 kids. And we all know that that's not, because of the scholarship limit, it can't be 50 full rides, first of all, and it's probably not 50 half rides. It's probably $500 here and $500 there. So I think what we saw this year was very similar to what we've seen in the past, but reduced. It just didn't have the ridiculous nature of offering, 25 kids $500 and just to get their name on the list, because this would be a year specifically when kids are making different decisions than they would in the past. Kids who are in high school are making different decisions about their finances because there's so much in the air. Quite frankly, with the virtual school, the virtual learning going on, your walk-on $500 scholarship player might not think it's worth it to go sit in a dorm and take virtual classes and pay $20,000 a year to do that. And I think that has an impact on that as well. Clearly, I have not ran any data to do it. I haven't done a study. It's just a gut feeling that that's what, or at least part of what has happened.
Let me ask.
And I think that could be another thing that takes a few years to really bear out if that becomes a trend. And I think that's something that we'll be watching very closely.
Chuck, let me ask you, we've talked about a lot of the conferences, obviously, in my neck of the woods, your neck of the woods. I know that you've had some familiarity with what was going down in the Lone Star. And then Brandon, I'm going to have you kind of follow up with specifically what's the MIAA looking to do in your neck of the woods, and then the GLVC right next door. Chuck, you first.
So the Lone Star was a really interesting scenario because a couple of their teams did manage to put schedules together in the fall. So you had West Texas A&M was able to play a few games, Angelo State was able to play a few games, and there may have been some others as well.
And pulled off a great upset too, Chuck.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. So it was Stephen F. Austin, I believe.
Or was it Abilene Christian, maybe? I don't recall, but I think it's one of those. But yes,
It was one of the FCS programs in Texas that is coached by a former national championship winning Division II head coach.
that also wears purple. So,
There we are.
anyway, go ahead. Sorry. Yes.
Very, very well researched.
Yeah.
So to the point we made a little bit earlier, some of the programs that were able to make something of the fall were very content to say that's our season. We're not going to play in the spring. So you had a couple of LSC programs that fell into that bucket. Texas A&M Commerce had said we're not going to play the spring football schedule. So you've got 3 to 4 programs that are already kind of out of the picture for playing in the spring. The remaining programs did express an interest in playing. And the conference actually did produce a schedule and said, this is how we're going to play our spring. After that happened, and it wasn't very long after that happened, I think you had an opt-out or two, and the league actually pulled back and said, it's not worth it. We're not going to have the spring schedule, which to their credit, if they really felt like it's not going to work and it's not worth it, right, let's just call it off.
I agree.
I think there probably might be some leagues out there, particularly more in the FCS level, that might like to say, maybe this championship in the spring is not a great idea. So they're not going to have a formal conference schedule in the Lone Star Conference, but you are going to have some games played. There's a few that have been put together. Midwestern State has a limited schedule that they're playing. Texas A&M Kingsville is playing a few, and UT Permian Basin is playing a few. So they are independent games. Most of those are real countable contests. I know one of Midwestern's games is billed as a scrimmage. So they've actually publicized that that's a scrimmage. I think that's against a GAC team, okay, that first game of the year. So you're going to have a little bit of a mixed bag there. Not a ton of teams taking the field in a formal way in the LSC, but again, it fits the model for this year for all of college football. Everybody's kind of just got to do what's best for them, and I think the LSC is kind of a microcosm of everybody just finding the best way to do what works for their school and for their program.
Brandon, how about for you with the MIAA and the GLVC? How are those two looking different?
Well, they're a lot different. The GLVC is going to play. I believe it's a 4-week or 4-game schedule. Then a 5th will match them up, I believe 1 through 5, to kind of create a championship. And so they're handling it like it's real. The MIAA, from everything I've heard, and I have to believe it's true because we're in February and we have not heard anything officially about schedules, that they're just going to play some scrimmage type things, and those could be very interesting. At least I've heard rumors that some GAC teams might travel up here. I'm sure some of the Northern Sun teams would like to play some of the Northern MIAA teams. Washburn, I know Washburn has a couple scrimmages scheduled, and they're just kind of a sprinkling of rumored scrimmages with nothing extremely official, at least that I've seen. That's not to say that they don't exist. But really what I'm getting at, Matt, is just there's nothing really official as far as games goes, and it's more of a situation, as you describe them or call them, NFL type practices, where somebody comes in or teams come in and they face each other in a very controlled setting. Having said that, guys, and I do have this question. In the NFL practices, at least 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when they had training camps and they would come and have those type of practices, the teams would do and play multiple days. Have you heard if it will be multiple days? What kind of structure have you guys heard?
On my end, I've heard same day type stuff.
Okay.
I think mostly because of the fact that they have a hard time justifying continued lodging or travel expense and things like that during this time. Gotcha. That's the impression I've gotten anyway. Maybe we'll see a little bit more than that. I get the impression that these guys are looking to do a lot of one-on-one, type of work, whether it's at the line of scrimmage or one-on-one receivers versus corners, all those type of things before they actually go ahead and do some type of structured scrimmage where they can have some control over things. I mean,
Right.
they're not going to go and try and take the quarterback out for the
Right.
opposing team. You know, and I think that was an important thing for the coaches I spoke with, is they wanted to have some type of control over this. You don't want things to get too heated, but at the same time, you know, these guys have been waiting to play someone else for a long time, and we've been kicking the can down the road for a while. And so they're going to be pretty amped about playing anybody else, I think,
Right.
at this point. Chuck, have you heard much down there about the scrimmages?
Well, I think one of the appealing aspects of possibly pulling together a scrimmage or two as opposed to real countable games is because it is not a game atmosphere where you have to pull together a game plan and execute a game week
Right.
like you would in the fall. You possibly have some opportunities to do, same day travel to and from, to limit the expenses of that. I think coaches would love to do multi-day practices and scrimmages like they do in the NFL during preseason. I think they would love to do that. I don't think it's economically feasible or desirable right now to put guys on buses and then stay a night or two in hotels to basically practice. But to that point, I think what's interesting to think about, and really through the whole experience of COVID, I think about this in all aspects of our life. What becomes a lasting change that that we'll look at and say, well, COVID was terrible, but we learned a couple things and we changed for the better. I do think about how will coaches approach the spring a couple of years from now. Typically, we don't see or even talk about scrimmages with other teams or practices with other teams. You really wonder, will there possibly be some interest in doing that a couple of years from now to make that spring maybe a little bit more live action? I don't know. Typically, the spring tends to be a little bit more laid back. A lot of guys don't even participate in spring drills for academic reasons, injury and rehabilitation. I don't know if that's really desirable, but maybe we start to see that as part of fall camps. Maybe we see some more scrimmages, possibly out of conference or even against a different division, just to get a little bit more game ready. So who knows? There's a lot of things that we're going to take out of the last year plus that we've learned from, a lot of things that we have to use to get better, and things that can change the game going forward. And maybe that's one area where we'll, a year from now, we'll see some things we hadn't seen in the past.
Chuck, I think if I'm a head coach, I think it would sharpen my team's focus if they knew a few weeks down the line we were scrimmaging somebody else. It's one thing when you're going against, your own squad. So I could see where teams would, from a motivation and focus standpoint, want to have something like that, a carrot they could dangle in the future, knowing that you're playing a different squad, preferably out of conference. But whatever it may be, I think it'd be a great thing going forward.
Yeah, I do too.
And it could work in conferences where there are divisions too. Your conference would be one, Matt, where teams from one division might not play some teams from another division, but you could have a joint practice and face a team that you're not going to play in the playoffs. Now that's or in the regular season. That's not a situation that works for everybody, but it could work on a case by case basis. One thing that we've been talking about COVID, it's a lot of negative things. Maybe have to talk about one more negative thing. We lost a West Coast program over the winter when Azusa Pacific decided to discontinue football, which follows a sad trend in the West Coast when it comes to football. Right before Division II started, there was a great conference comprised of many schools in the West. And just recently, in the D2football.com era, Western Washington's dropped football, and Azusa Pacific's dropped football. Humboldt State's dropped football, making it very tough for for Simon, or not Simon Fraser because they're new, but certainly Central Washington and Western Oregon. I can't tell you how much respect I have for those schools and those programs to keep pushing forward when it probably would have been easy just to quit playing football as well. Do you guys?
It's tough to make a go of it.
Yeah,
In some areas of the country, it's really tough. The other casualty that we had early in the COVID experience was Florida Tech.
right. Yeah.
And that was really a shame because that's a program that really was having a lot of success. And West Florida completely wrecked the curve for new programs because
Yes.
they were in the national championship game twice in their first 4 years. But Florida Tech was too. They really had a great thing going there. That they had outstanding leadership. They were getting great athletes, and they were putting really competitive teams on the field. And that was a program that I felt was set up for long-term success. The challenge that they had being on the Atlantic coast of Florida is there just isn't anybody else down there. When they made that announcement, I looked at the map and kind of calculated the distances for their road trips. Their closest road trip game from a football perspective, their closest was further away than the longest road trip that a SAC team has during the season. So it's just that it's very difficult to make a go of it if you're in an area of the country where your competitors are not in close proximity. And certainly that's been a challenge in the GNAC for years, and it's a problem that only gets worse. And I fear that, as the rest of this year goes on and maybe in the next year, we may see more. I'm grateful we haven't seen more dropped at this point.
Right.
I do have concerns going forward about a couple teams in a couple of areas, but certainly you have to have some sympathy for the administrations that have to make those decisions and the difficult time they were already having trying to make it work in some of those areas.
I do for some, but in all honesty, Chuck, I think some of them just simply use football as a way to buy themselves a few more years as an administrator, as a president or whatever. Cut football, you save your budget, and you don't look at the long-term effects of it. So I don't think that there's a, there's a definite yes or no, or a definite it's bad or it's good. But I think a lot of places I've seen have used that as an excuse. Humboldt State is a situation where they allegedly misled people as far as the finances go, and probably should still have a football program. But yes, you're right. I'm glad that a lot of schools that might have been in trouble or could make it more, a little easier on themselves by eliminating football have not done that. So that's a good thing. Matt, you have a good experience with the NAIA.
Yeah, and Florida Tech is Florida Tech was a case study I'd like to be able to dive into a little bit more. They made that decision in, gosh, I don't know, April or May, when the impact of COVID was still pretty new. So right. that raised some eyebrows with me to think this isn't simply just a lost revenue because of COVID. There's some other factors in there.
I had read that they were already having revenue issues, and this would be like one of those types of casualties that I talked about. But again, going back to Matt, you have a ton of history in the NAIA. You were a veteran NAIA columnist, just like you're now a veteran Division II columnist. In order to help the West Coast in football, are there candidates out there who might reclassify from the NAIA to Division II?
Well, you take a look at the Frontier League of the NAIA, which is a lot of Montana teams, along with some Idaho and a little bit, a little bit further to the coast as well with Oregon and so forth. But I've always gotten the impression that league is pretty happy with what they got going there in terms of their geographic footprint. So much of it being in Montana that their travels are a lot easier than if they were to go D2. Then their travels become a fair amount more potentially. More trips towards the coast, less against Montana teams. There was talk for a while years ago that maybe some teams like Carroll College, who's had a ton of 6 championships, that they may make the move shortly after Sioux Falls did, because they were 2 teams that were kind of locked in a rivalry, and maybe we'll go there as well, and maybe their in-state rival Montana Tech and some others like that. But it never did happen, and I'm just not sure that those programs are not quite where they once were now when you take a look at them. So I don't know if they're quite as motivated to test themselves at the next level that maybe they would have been in the past. So I'm not real sure I see that happening, but when we talked earlier about games getting played, this winter/spring, I can tell you right now, when they start playing games in mid-March, it's going to be kind of interesting watching some of those games up in northern Montana, which there's not too many places that are going to be colder in the United States. We might see some record lows for football games in terms of temperatures and whatnot. But you know what? A lot of this spring, if we can't fully get into what our own team may be doing because maybe they're just doing a scrimmage and they're not doing regular gameplay, this is a chance to take a look around also during this spring to what else, whether it's NAIA, whether it's FCS, appreciate all levels of small college football. I mean, we're going to have our regular gameplay back in the fall before you know it. And there's still plenty of, D2 games to watch, whether it's the GLVC, obviously some of the other leagues as well. So I think this is a spring like no other where we are looking around going, wow, everybody's not doing necessarily the same thing, but it makes it for an interesting watch for sure.